Yeah. What about in terms of, let's say, intermittent fasting? I've heard the more evolutionary side of this argument of, when we were, cavemen, we could only eat in a certain period of time because this and that. But now from your research, does that argument hold up as to why because from your, presentation, I found that when you eat in a time restricted manner, you're more, you're more optimally used to lose weight, sleep better, and a lot of the processes we do daily. So what's your thoughts on that?
So just quick for the record,
Yeah.
that's not my research.
Okay,
That's,
yes, yeah.
It's mainly one of my colleagues, Sachin Panda, who works at the Salk. But I'm a big fan of his work because he's really taken some of the basic studies and then applied it to look at other organisms. It's basic studies in mice and flies and applied it to look in humans. So the big finding that they found was a big difference between mice eating round the clock and mice eating just for 8 hours a day. And eating, those 8 hours were in their waking time. And they could give them crazy diets that make the mice eating any time of day put on massive amounts of weight. Or that same diet, same calories, the same overall food intake, but restricted to 8 hours a day, so that's the intermittent fasting,
Yeah.
they don't put on weight. And that kind of actually blows up this whole idea of calories to some extent, right? Because those mice had eaten the same amount, and yet they're totally different weights.
Is there nuance in there, or is that very clear cut
That's
of the
very,
difference?
very clear cut. Yeah, I mean, you look at, they let the experiment run for 20 weeks, so 5 months. And I forget the percentage change, but if you look at, you've got a regular looking mouse and you've got this obese mouse. And in that obese mouse, it's got fatty liver disease, it looks diabetic or pre-diabetic. I mean, it's a mess.
Yeah.
So then they tried to say what happens in humans. And first of all, they had to measure when a human's eating, and we typically think, I have breakfast at 8 a.m. and dinner at 7 p.m. and I'm fine. I'm within that 8 to 10 to 12 hours that seems to be safe for mice. But actually humans we tend to stretch out our days with late night snacks or a little drink late at night or ice cream. And so many of us as a human population are eating 15 or more hours a day.
Jeez.
And so then when you start to restrict the time that so you do kind of intermittent fasting or time restricted eating, for those people, they often lose a good few kilos quite quickly, and they can keep it off.
So it is, because I want to hear about the nuance and the variability of this type of research. So because I've heard my friends do it as well. They only eat in an 8-hour window, and they say they've lost a lot of weight. But with others, they do it, and I'm not sure how committed they were, but it didn't really work on them. And they even got more hungry and tired and lethargic. And I was like saying, okay, like, is this a general statement, or does this work on certain chronotypes?
Yeah, so that's interesting, right? So you could imagine, right? The idea then would be to eat when your liver is most functional, which is the day, but the day is pretty general. And so if some of us are morning larks or night owls, the peak of liver activity could actually shift a little bit. And so I guess in a most nuanced way, you would want to align your chronotype, your internal time, with all your meals and everything, so you're going to metabolize everything most efficiently.
How does one understand their chronotype? Well, basically, maybe explain what chronotype is.
Chronotype literally means, in the same way we have blood type or anything like that, we have a chronotype where chrono is time. And the simplest way it's measured is by getting the mid phase of your sleep. So if you sleep typically, and you have to do this for several weeks to figure it out fairly accurately, but if you sleep from midnight to 8 a.m., then your chronotype is going to be roughly 4.
Okay.
The mid phase of sleep. And that's when but there's a distribution, and it changes with age. I mean, young children are going to be much earlier than that, even if they're sleeping for long times. Yeah. Teenagers go a little bit later, but then there's variability even if you look across people of a similar age. So I think we're really just beginning this, trying to understand the best time to eat for an individual. I mean, this is part of what I would call a hopeful shift in medicine, right?
Yeah.
We talk about personalized medicine, and this would be one feature of it. What is the best time for an individual to eat, to take their drugs? That chronotype can even apply to your athletic time. So people that wake up early morning, they tend to have actually it's pretty constant athletic time or peak athletic time during the day. But if you're a late chronotype, that early morning time is really hard time to exercise, and you're well below your maximum. And this is related, the idea is this is related not to your alertness, but actually to your muscle activity, to the clocks in your muscles driving, being able to function at their maximum. But at this point, I would say, we're into a gray area of what actually is happening in the muscle. I certainly don't know. Some people might. But this chronotype does affect a lot of different bodily functions.
So now we can understand, like, what's the best time to eat, what's the best time to work out, and that, like, raises the question of, like, we're designing our life to be, the most optimal, productive performance. But in terms of sleep, though, how would your chronotype affect sleep, or how would your body, your muscles, liver, etc., how does that contribute to sleep? Because I know when, living on a university, it's like you sleep very late, you sometimes wake up early, and then the whole day you just you're very phased, you're very muddled, you can't concentrate as sharp. But then contrary to the days where you've had sleep, you just feel a lot sharper, you don't need coffee. How does that play, and what's the best time, or all that stuff?
That's a lot of questions in one. That's fine. But I think it's interesting because in the same way that there are differences in chronotype, different people seem to need different amounts of sleep.
Yeah.
Right. So the average everyone says is 8 hours, but there are plenty of people that would do totally fine with a bit less, and there are plenty of people that seem to need a bit more than 8 hours. So again, it's like height. We have these curves, we have these variations and everything. Exactly how that is controlled genetically is not so clear, although there's one gene I know of which is really associated with short sleepers, people that typically do very well on quite short sleep, 4 to 6 hours, but that's fairly rare. In terms of putting everything together, you then have both your kind of sleep need, which is going to change as an adolescent. That's going to be higher in your kind of late teenage years, early 20s. And when you're doing everything, one thing I'm grateful of at NYU Abu Dhabi is classes don't start quite as early as they used to. So everything in the UAE starts really early. A lot of high schools will start at 7:30, 7:45. And when I first started teaching here, classes started at 8:30. And now the first class on a typical semester is 9.
Yeah.
Maybe it was even earlier than 8:30. But it just seemed, especially for these kind of teenagers who are shifted a little late in their chronotype, a little bit inhumane and not ideal. So what students are you going to get in your 8:30 a.m. class? You could take the same people and they'll be high functioning by 10 a.m., but 8:30 it's more of a struggle to get going.
Yeah. But how about you mentioned how schools are designed, and especially in the States, and in some parts of New Zealand as well, they start very early, and then they end around 3:30, 4. How would you discussed it, the timing of your school, when your school starts, really dramatically affects your grades they achieve. And how can, authorities or public policy makers change this, or, what would be the best solution to it?
Right. So let's start with the biology, which is essentially that the teenage body needs more sleep, and it seems to shift a little bit later, almost as if the clock is running a little bit slow. So you wake up your ideal time of waking is going to be a couple of hours, a few hours later than when you become an adult. Same person. So asking any teenagers to function effectively at 7 or 8 in the morning is like asking an adult person to function really, really well at 5 or 6 a.m. A few people would do it, but it's not the time we would choose to learn. So yeah, there was a study in Seattle where they shifted the school start time just by 1 hour. And they showed that the teenagers were getting more sleep, which we all know is beneficial to mood, health, growth, all of that stuff. But what happened then was that actually many people, the grades went up and people were late much less and people were absent much less. Mm-hmm. The question of what's the ideal time has to come as a balance between obviously the students, who should be the primary concern, but also the teachers who have to function, right? So you can't have them working way off their ideal alertness. Yeah. So it looks like, you know, a 1 hour to 2 hour shift could be phenomenal in terms of learning and wakeness. On the other hand, you've got to balance that with maybe parents helping getting their kids off to school and the work life. Yeah. So I wouldn't want my teenagers waking up by themselves. You know, I happily, or I help them get out of the door in the morning just to make sure they get the day off to start right.
But don't you think it's kind of sort of like an unfair advantage if a school starts late and then another school starts early? Because statistically, the grades of the school starting earlier, they wouldn't do as well as, you know, school starting later. Whereas when they're applying for scholarships or grants or etc., does this not beg the question of unfairness or unequitable, you know, differences?
But schools are already inequitable. Mm-hmm. I mean, you have different teachers, different head teachers that set the tone for a particular school. These schools are in different socioeconomic parts of town, so there are already all kinds of inequities. I think if you just... So I guess the question is, is this going to be up to the schools to choose? Mm-hmm. Or is this something that would happen at a district or even universe level?
Yeah, because
whole country.
If you think about a lot of the opportunities students miss out on is typically to do with their grades and they're not meeting a certain standard. Yeah. Yet, you know, if we talk about like, you know, the structures designed, how are they designed and are they optimally designed for a student to do well, or has it just been designed that way and it's kept that way because of tradition and standards?
I would say it seems to be the tradition and the standards. Yeah. And certainly in the US, high schools tend to start earlier than elementary schools. And often the children are traveling from further away, which exacerbates that even more. One of the interesting things, so in this study in Seattle, in a fairly affluent society, fairly affluent high school where the students were of a higher socioeconomic class, that actually didn't change the absences and tardinesses of the kids going to school. But in a poorer school, those kids were coming up to the same level as the kids from the more affluent school or the more affluent neighborhood. So in a way, having a later start time could actually be an equalizer across socioeconomic status and give the kids from a poorer background higher chance of success. But I agree. I mean, it would be a very complicated algorithm to try and look at, would you keep the kids from the more affluent neighborhood at an earlier start time to rig it in the opposite direction? I don't think so. So it has to be a balance between all these factors, and again, the adults in the room, who the teachers who need to be there during the daytime. It's complicated, and it's hard to change these systems that are set in stone. But the Seattle School District was happy to experiment with this change by 1 hour. And I have to say, I don't know after that 1 year what they did, but the evidence is pretty clear that the later start time was benefiting students. So I hope they kept it that way.
And is there like a rhythm or a time clock on your learning? You know, when is the best and optimal time to learn? And does it cycle through? You know, is there a cycle to which time you learn best and which time you should just stop learning?
So again, there are optimal times for alertness, and there are optimal kind of sleepy times. I mean, the mid-afternoon is an obvious kind of lull. There's a dip in the alertness coming from your circadian clocks. Having said that, there's also going to be variability from person to person. What you eat can kind of accentuate that mid-afternoon slump
Yeah.
or minimize it depending on what you eat. And I don't know the details, but I know I've never figured it out. But there are days when I really crash in the afternoon, and there are days when I'm just fine. So it's complicated.
Mm-hmm.
But most people, massive generalization here, but most people, okay, again, it's different between adults and teenagers. But I would say adults would generally go for that morning time.
Mm-hmm.
Teenagers probably shift a little bit later because their morning, they're not quite as alert yet. They haven't fully come out of sleep till a bit later.